Welcome to 15 Minutes in the Book of Revelation. I'm Pastor Chester Hitchcock, and in this video we're dealing with chapter 18, where we find the fall of Babylon. Now these videos are short and fast-paced, so if you want to get the most out of each lesson, you'll want to have your Bible with you and have it open this time to chapter 18 and follow along as I discuss the verses so that we don't have to take the time to read each one of them. As I mentioned in the last video, chapters 17 and 18 generally are seen by scholars as a unit, much in the same way that chapters 2 and 3 are when it discusses the seven churches. Chapters 17 and 18 symbolically describe the futility of sin in human history, from creation to the second coming. In chapter 17, it does so by symbolizing Rome as the harlot on the beast. And in chapter 18, it does it by symbolizing the fall of Babylon. Babylon is the Old Testament symbol of futility and sin, and Rome is the New Testament symbol of futility and sin. So if you want to watch the previous video first, simply click on the link that you'll see momentarily show up in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that is titled Harlot on the Beast. But if you want to proceed with this video, that's fine, and you can go back and watch that one later. The heading in chapter 18 of most Bibles says something like, the fall of Babylon the Great. Let me begin by saying that the word Babylon is derived from the word that is first found in Genesis chapter 11, verse 9, in the story of the Tower of Babel. In verse 9 of Genesis chapter 11, it says, therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the earth. Some have said that the word Babylon means spiritual confusion, though there really isn't any support for that specificity. It simply means confusion. However, they might be making the application due to the fact that the Tower of Babel was an attempt by the descendants of Noah to build a tower, that if God ever caused such a flood as he did in Noah's day, that they would be able to climb the tower to the gate of heaven. That makes it sound like it's spiritual confusion because at least they were trying to get to heaven. But having said that, here's another interesting thing about the etymology of the word Babel. It comes from two separate Akkadian words, Bab meaning gate and El meaning God, or the gate of God. The city of Babel, which would eventually become Babylon, was built after Noah's flood by Nimrod. Scholars do not identify Nimrod as a religious man, even though Genesis chapter 10 verse 9 refers to him as a mighty hunter before the Lord. That doesn't mean that he had to be religious. Rather, Nimrod was actually a very godless man, one whose name was invoked in Micah chapter 5 verse 6 in relation to Assyria. The biblical Assyrians being seen as wicked and godless. So for this reason, to define the word Babylon as spiritual confusion, rather than just simply confusion, can ultimately confuse the interpretation of Babylon in the book of Revelation. When we define it as spiritual confusion, one generally turns to those whom they identify as being spiritually confused, resulting in the call to come out of Babylon to mean come out of your church that is spiritually confused and my church which is not. It would be well for us all to remember that 1 Corinthians 13 verses 9 through 12 tells us that we understand in part and that we see through a glass dimly, and that means that we all have a level of spiritual confusion. Someone once said that when it comes to the Bible, we have many things to learn and many things to unlearn, and God alone in heaven is infallible. It's very important for us to understand what Babylon means before getting into this chapter. Because as a general rule, the direction in which you start your journey will determine where you end up. Babylon does not mean spiritual confusion. It simply means confusion. It isn't referring to those who are confused while they are seeking to serve God, but those who are confused due to godlessness and their belief that they can escape this world on their own regardless of what God says he will or will not do. So if you have your Bible open to Revelation chapter 18, let's get started. Verses 1 and 2 tell us that a mighty angel from heaven proclaims Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. Some translations say has fallen, has fallen. In the Greek, it's in the aorist tense. That means that it's in the past tense. If we define Babylon as a future religio-political power, it becomes hard to apply the past tense statement to it. But if we understand that Babylon is the Old Testament symbol of sin and wickedness, and that Rome is the New Testament symbol of sin and wickedness, and that both represent godless mankind under the leadership of the serpent or the beast or Satan, then and only then can we apply the past tense to his defeat. John, who wrote the book of Revelation, quotes Jesus as saying in John chapter 12, verse 31, "Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world is cast out. And I, if I be lifted up, will draw all men to me." John chapter 12, Jesus is predicting his death on the cross, and he is proclaiming that at his death, sin, wickedness, godlessness, led by Satan, would fall. It would be defeated as a great power over mankind. Babylon the Great would no longer be great. Sin, wickedness, and godlessness would no longer be so great. Satan himself would no longer be a great power because he has fallen. At the cross, Jesus struck Satan with a deadly wound, and those who have been confused about the power of sin and the power of Satan need to come out of her, my people, as Revelation 18, verse 4 says. Some interpret the feminine pronoun her to be symbolic of an apostate church, making this again about spiritual confusion in churches that claim to follow God who really are not. However, I pointed out that in chapter 17 regarding the harlot, that in Old Testament prophetic discourse, harlot generally denotes religious apostasy. However, Robert Mounce, in his commentary on the book of Revelation, which I have shared with you before, he says this: in the context of Revelation chapter 17 and 18, the imagery is not that of religious profligacy, but that of the prostitution of all that is right and noble for the questionable ends of power and luxury, page 307. Then Mounce takes it where we have seen the symbols of Revelation before, namely, from the beginning until the end. He says this: John's images are timeless in that they portray the essential conflicts of mankind from the beginning of time until the end. If we miss, or worse, if we deny that the harlot, the beast, Rome, Babylon, all that is found in chapters 17 and 18, if we deny that they portray the essential conflicts of mankind from the beginning of time until the end, then we leave ourselves open to conspiracy theories that have become so prevalent in churches over the past couple of centuries. If the entire book of Revelation doesn't portray the conflicts of mankind from the beginning of time until the end, then we are left with the idea that sometime in the future, in the last days, there will be a new world order that will arise, unlike any that has been since the beginning. And God's true people will be persecuted by others who only think that they are doing God's will. But here's the thing: that has been going on since the beginning of time. And a new world order doesn't need to arise for that to continue to happen. But the call to come out of her, my people, is not a call to come out of one church that is spiritually confused into another church with different points of spiritual confusion. Because quite frankly, we all see through a glass dimly, as 1 Corinthians 13 verses 9 through 12 tells us. Conspiracy theories are powerful, and conspiracy theories that are mistakenly crafted with biblical passages are very difficult to discern. Revelation chapter 18, verse 7 gives us some insight on how to discern Babylon and those who dwell there. It reads, quote, "In the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow, for she says in her heart, I sit as queen, I am no widow, I will not see sorrow." Again, the feminine pronouns she and her are used here, but don't let that distract you from missing the elements of Babylon in this verse that can be applied to any person, leader, man, or woman. She glorifies herself. In other words, she's focused on her needs rather than others. She lives luxuriously. The Greek word luxuriously can be translated sensually, relating it back to the harlot of chapter 17, but basically meaning that she is focused upon her own gratification of senses, especially sexual pleasure. She says in her heart, I am queen. In other words, I'm the one who is in charge. She glories in her own power of position, claiming everything that is good to be of her own. Also claims she is no widow, refusing to accept any sort of loss. Claims to see no sorrow, refusing any failure. History is riddled with kings and queens and leaders of every title who have glorified themselves, who have lived luxuriously and sensually and claimed power by position, refusing to admit any mistakes and refusing to admit any failures. Which brings us back to the angel's proclamation that this godless lifestyle has fallen, and those associated with it must come out to avoid sharing in its destruction. But just as verses 1 through 8 proclaims Babylon's fall as well as its doom, look at verses 9 through 20, because they proclaim the world's fascination and attraction to Babylon. Most Bibles have a heading something like, "The world mourns Babylon's fall." Once again, throughout human history, from the beginning of time until the end, there have been and will continue to be kings of the earth, or we might say people in high places, who, as verse 9 says, committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her, or we might say in today's culture, supported and participated in the deceptions and cruelty. Notice verse 10 says, standing at a distance for fear of her torment. Verse 11 says, and the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Verses 12 and 13 list all of the merchants who mourn Babylon's fall because no one buys their merchandise anymore. Again, we see this throughout human history, where kings and queens and leaders of all sorts held great influence and control over their subjects in their land, where other community officers followed such leaders for fear of being destroyed in their community in one way or another. But when that great leader finally comes to their well-deserved demise, the merchants, that is, the leaders in the society, try to distance themselves, as verse 10 says, standing at a distance. But it's too late. Society has had even enough of them. People no longer want to buy their merchandise. They no longer want to buy their rhetoric as society leaders. Babylon has fallen, has fallen. When these beast-like leaders in history finally meet their end, they take down with them those who were their supporters. Come out of her, my people, verse 4 says, lest you receive of her plagues. Verses 14 through 19 repeats the theme of verses 9 through 13. It's kind of like saying, it's not enough to say it once, let's say it again. The merchants, the community, society leaders who followed along, mourn their great leader's fall, weeping and wailing and complaining. No less than 3 times it says in chapter 18 that Babylon's demise happened suddenly. Verse 10 says, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. Verse 17 says, "For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing." Verse 19 says, "For in 1 hour she is made desolate." Throughout history, there have been great leaders who were believed to be too rich to become poor, too popular to lose, too arrogant to admit failure, whose followers were loyal to a fault, but suddenly, in 1 hour, judgment has come. Finally, verse 20 of chapter 18 has a sudden change of focus. "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her." Yes, that's what it says. Rejoice, for God has avenged those who have suffered under the reign of this Babylon, under the cruelty of despotic leaders. Those who have refused to join themselves to the popularity and riches can now rejoice. And the chapter ends with verses 21 through 24 declaring the finality of Babylon's fall, the finality of this godless, amoral character. Traditional interpretations that identify Babylon as a future religio-political power miss the beast that is present throughout history. In every era of history, there have been beast-like leaders. It is their character that identifies them in the book of Revelation, not their title or what their numeric number of their name adds up to, but regardless of who they are or what position they hold in the world or what generation they arise in human history, Revelation 18 verses 21 through 24 makes it clear that their destruction is certain and our call to depart from them is essential. Verse 21 says, "Then a mighty angel took a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found any more." A great stone like a millstone? I am certain that this is not coincidence that Jesus proclaimed a warning for those who enact cruelty upon children wherever they are from. Matthew chapter 18 verse 6 and Luke 17 verse 2, Jesus is recorded as saying that those who cause harm to children will indeed pay for it in the judgment. Quote, "For it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea." Matthew 18 verse 6 in the NIV. Revelation 17 and 18 are unit. The harlot on the beast itself. Rome that was symbolized in chapter 17 and Babylon of chapter 18 are all manifested throughout history. It's not about a future power. It's not about a new world order. Jesus himself said that when he returns, that it will be like the days of Noah. People will be eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, Matthew 24 verses 37 through 39. That it will be like it was in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah. People will be eating and drinking and buying and selling, planting and building, Luke chapter 17 verse 28. If it makes you wonder about the prophecy of where there will be no buying and selling, go back to the video where I deal with Revelation chapter 13 and see how I address that as well. But while the spirit or the character of Babylon is fallen or futile, it has always been a presence in this fallen world and will be no different in the final days of Earth's history than it has been throughout the last days, which began at the fall of mankind. The next video will be dealing with chapter 19. You won't want to miss it. But if this video has been helpful, give me a thumbs up and share it with someone that you know. And if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel yet, click on that subscribe button, ring the bell, and choose all so that you can get a notification the next time a video is produced. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.